A decade ago, the Kahn family renovated this rundown old Victorian in Newton, Massachusetts. It was stripped down to the studs and rebuilt. Everything was new, except for maybe one thing.
She was an older woman with gray hair. She always kept it in a tight bun on the top of her head. She wore a long dress and always wore stockings.
Julielle was not even 5 years old when her encounters with the friendly lady on the third floor began.
There would be either a blue or a white sort of orb light thing floating around, and a face would appear in it, and then eventually the whole body would appear, but her feet were never on the floor. She was always floating. She told me she lived here when she was younger.
Were you afraid?
I was never afraid. She told me she loved children and that there was no reason to be afraid.
She told her parents the woman insisted she call her Mrs. Woodman, and that she wanted Julielle to put her hair up in a bun and wear dresses and tights, since it wasn't ladylike to wear pants.
When pressed, what do you mean you're talking to the lady? I'm talking to Mrs. Woodman, and she's upstairs.
It's Mrs. Woodman, and she says, she speaks to me, but her lips don't move.
The kindergarten teacher called, curious about this Mrs. Woodman who began appearing in Julielle's family drawings.
She would draw Mrs. Woodman, and then she would scribble through her as if she was invisible or floating.
The 5-year-old's mention of the names Woodman and Gridley prompted Mom to dig through old city directories.
Wasn't really finding anything until I got to the 1899 directory, and I found the name Dr. George and Mrs. Woodman, and that caused me to pause.
I was probably most freaked out when Donalyn came home and said, Julielle actually has the name right.
How could she have known that? I came back and started asking her, Julielle, who is Mrs. Woodman?
Turns out Mrs. Woodman was the former Jane Gridley. Born in 1830, she grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts. She married Dr. George Woodman, who built the Newton House in 1877, and the two had 7 children.
It really wasn't even information that you could find on the internet. It was actually having to go back into like Newton Historical Society and pull records out of City Hall.
She was right on with the number of children she had and the sex of the children.
She started telling us about the poetry lady, and that was very quizzical, like she's friends with the poetry lady.
Mrs. Woodman's poetry lady was apparently Emily Dickinson, who references Jane Gridley in some of her letters and attended Amherst Academy with her.
They knew each other, they were aware of each other, they had been in the same classroom together.
An Amherst College student also wrote about Jane Gridley in the 1840s, calling her Jenny.
Jenny is the prettiest and most charming girl in Amherst.
And often mentioned her lovely singing voice and piano playing. Julielle, who coincidentally shares an April 14th birthday with Mrs. Woodman, says she would often sing or hum and was pleased there was music in the house again.
She was very happy that we had redone the house and made it look pretty again, and she said she was very happy that the kids played instruments.
It really makes you think, what is going on here that a 4-and-a-half-year-old could have that kind of information and communication and be okay with it? It's not like in the movies where, you know, bad things are happening or dishes are flying around the house, or it all seems to be pretty positive, so I'm okay with it.
It's such a grand house. I mean, I kind of feel like I'm just the steward of this house. I'm just borrowing it from her for, you know, a short period of time.
Julielle says she saw and spoke to the ghost for about 5 years before the encounters ended. But Mrs. Woodman left some unanswered questions for the family.
She always told me there was something missing. So I kept asking her what it is she wanted and what we needed to get. And she told me we needed to buy something, but she couldn't say what it was. As I got older, she would mention it more. It got more important to her, I guess.
A trip to Amherst, where old cemetery records confirm Mrs. Woodman is buried, made them wonder. This is the Woodman plot.
I know that she's missing a headstone, and I think she has some expectation of me buying it for her.
Some nights, the dishwasher and TV turn on. No electrician can explain why. The Kahns have heard footsteps and rhythmic tapping on the walls, and they have trouble with electronics on the 3rd floor, which is the only place in the house where we had audio issues.
She would appear back there, and I would sort of stand around where we are right now.
But all in all, this has been a positive experience.
I miss her sometimes, but when she turns on the TV or the dishwasher or dims the lights, it's sort of a reassurance.
And they leave soap in the dishwasher should Mrs. Woodman make the rounds. Leslie Gatiss, NECN.